Um, so before we begin tonight's forum, we'd like to acknowledge that those of us living in San Diego are settlers residing on unceded Kumeyaay territory. We honor with gratitude this land and the Kumeyaay people who stewarded this land for hundreds of years. We recognize the history of violence, genocide, displacement, and colonialism inflicted upon the indigenous peoples here and all over the world. Let our reflection and discussion tonight carry us forward to being better stewards of this land and remind us of the call to be better co-conspirators in the ongoing struggle for indigenous peoples' rights and sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So as I said, I'm with the Tech Workers Coalition, and over the past year, TWC and many other organizations in San Diego, quite a few of which are in this room now, have been working together in the Trust Coalition and successfully campaigned for 2 surveillance ordinances in San Diego, which mandate transparency around the purchase of surveillance technology and set up a privacy advisory board, which essentially creates community oversight for these purchases. And this was a big success, and we wanted to do something to celebrate it, which is part of what this event tonight is about. But there's also a long way to go. So, for example, like the recent events in Chula Vista show with police kind of secretly handing over data to ICE, and kind of many other reminders that these sort of ordinances are just the first step. And so in this kind of in-between space and right before the new year, we wanted to do a bit of blue sky thinking. So not necessarily kind of brainstorming specific actions, although that is very welcome. So if you have specific ideas, please feel free to bring them into the space. But to kind of imagine what a world without surveillance might look like. And let me just share the screen again. So is that clear to everyone? Perfect. So this kind of community forum or workshop tonight is about the question of what does safety without surveillance look like? And I'd like to acknowledge all of the like amazing work that went into this event. So first of all, Carmela and Mike, who from the Asian Solidarity Collective, who did a lot of work on putting together the schedule and reaching out to our partners, and San Diego Surge, so showing up for racial justice, particularly Nancy, who's our accessibility coordinator, whom you've already heard from, and Christy, who is organizing the Zoom and sort of security for the event tonight, as well as many other chat moderators from all these organizations that you'll meet later today. And we also have a variety of kind of community partners who work on kind of other, a lot of whose work touches on surveillance, or more generally kind of progressive causes in San Diego. There's, I think, representatives from these organizations here today. So if you'd like to get involved with any of them, we definitely recommend that you do so. And the agenda for today will be sort of the welcome that we're doing now, and then a panel in which three organizers of this event will share some of their own answers to that question. Then we will spend half an hour in breakout rooms in smaller groups where you can all sort of share what your own thoughts on the question are, and a whole group debrief back in the main room where we can have a general discussion. Feel free to use the chat function throughout to ask questions or make comments. We won't have a formal Q&A, but if you have specific questions, maybe note them down and we can get to them in the whole group debrief or in the discussion room, in the breakout rooms. And I think that's all on the logistics. So for our first panelist, I'd like to invite Nancy from Showing Up for Racial Justice. Oh, Nancy, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Good. Okay, I did that so everybody else feels comfortable doing it too. I'm Nancy Relaford. I am a member of Showing Up for Racial Justice San Diego. I'm here because, well, I'm here speaking because shortly ago, I was at a panel where Lily Irani and I think Julia too were talking about security and the smart streetlights and so forth, and kind of how that came about. And I was like, hit with, like, all of a sudden everything made sense. I felt like Claire Danes on Homeland, where she's like, mapping everything out with strings on her wall. As part of my job at the library, Geisel Library at UC San Diego, I was, for the last several years, director of safety and security and emergency planning. And as such, I was in charge of the surveillance cameras in the building. And if you'll excuse me, we each have 5 minutes. It's going to be a mercifully very, very brief panel. So I wrote things down so I don't, so I can kind of stay on topic, because there's so many different stories from the library, but I'm only going to give you a tip of an iceberg. But anyway, hearing the kind of how the smart streetlight saga unfolded, so that by the end, police, law enforcement, whoever had access to all of this data and capabilities without the people who had purchased, approved, installed the cameras really kind of ever approving it or knowing that. It was exactly like my own experience at the library. So let's see, a quick bit on libraries. Libraries are traditionally very, have very deep and traditional values of privacy, intellectual freedom, freedom of information, which is part of why I really love working in libraries. So one kind of example of that is after 9/11, when the Patriot Act was coming through, the Patriot Act had one section that required bookstores and libraries and other information providers to provide user information to the FBI on demand, and they were prohibited to inform anyone, even within the organization, but especially the person who information was requested about, that there had even been a request. So library organizations and individuals resisted, strongly lobbied against the legislation, along with a lot of other people at the time. And I still have my hysterical librarian button somewhere, because librarians in particular were considered hysterical, just like anyone who opposes surveillance and so forth. Anyway, after it was law, most libraries reviewed what information they were collecting, either actively or passively, just because it stayed there after being collected, and consciously stopped retaining anything that wasn't critical to the library operation. So for instance, we would keep your patron record linked to specific materials and books only for as long as you had the books. And then once they were returned and checked in, instead of like retaining a history of everything you had ever borrowed, either for like statistics or planning, or just because, we started consciously just deleting that information. So it wasn't there, because if you don't have information, you can't give it to anyone. Rule number one. So there were also tales or rumors of passive resistance, like posting a sign at the desk of the library saying the FBI has not been in your library today, so that if the sign disappeared, you could kind of take that information. So things like that. It was a very big deal for libraries. And so that's the background. And also another reason I loved working in libraries is because I share those values very deeply, and am, left of center, left of liberal, my own politics and values are very in line with that. So, so that's the background of my story about being responsible for the video surveillance system in my library as it drifted over to something that I, well, anyway, didn't understand, didn't have control of. So I see how that can happen. So Julia, how am I doing on time? Okay, the rest is quick. So long story short, between about 1998 and 2016, we went from having in the Geisel Library building, which if you're familiar with it is a huge brutalist structure, very large building. We would have up to 2,000 people in the building at busy times. So it's kind of a small city, but we started having fewer than 10 cameras. They were black and white and grainy. They were only stationed at the building entrances, and they recorded to a VCR that was located in the library security office with a regular biweekly schedule for me or someone else to tape over the VCR tapes and reuse them or destroy them. So we had complete control of our surveillance system, and it was mostly to see who came in and out in case there were any questions about that, especially when the building was closed. So by 2016, when I retired, we had a really cool digital video system with 50 plus color cameras at entrances, elevator landings, service desks, and other kind of public traffic areas. We still had a conscious plan not to put them in areas where people were using library materials or computers. And we had, they were recording 2 servers controlled and operated by campus police, because we had started with the bookstore and then campus consolidated the bookstore video surveillance operation into campus police. So that wasn't a decision, that was just a drift. We had a formal policy saying that it required campus police to formally request access to library video recordings for particular incidents, and required subpoenas from other agencies and working with the police. We had a verbal agreement that the library video would not be accessed by anyone but the system administrators without authorization from us and a firewall, but that never quite got written and signed. And by the time I left, a dawning realization that those policies were not being followed strictly and maybe not at all. So there's a lot more to that, but that's kind of what happened. So lessons learned about video surveillance. Number 1 is cameras do not keep people safe. That's not even really what they're there for. They also, according to research, don't significantly reduce crime themselves. 2, there will be mission creep and unintended consequences. Once you have a system, you need a better system. Once you have a admin who's working for part of campus or part of a big organization, then vendors will give you beta tests. So you get free things or cheap things. And so you're always getting cool things. Just the logic of the system is that it needs to be better. It needs to be more. Technology goes away. So you need the new technology, so forth. Anyway, and they will say, this has all these capabilities, but don't worry, we won't turn it on, which is what happened in I think San Diego and maybe Chula Vista. But you don't control that, whether it's turned on or not, or what it's doing. Surveillance culture and mindset is based on fear and driven by law enforcement and vendors, plus useful idiots, plus maybe shadowy masterminds, I don't know. The strongest privacy policy doesn't mean anything if you don't know and can't find out whether it's being followed. And that's why organizations and tech people like the Tech Workers Coalition and the Electronic Frontier Foundation are so important in keeping things transparent and honest. And then just finally, in my own thinking about positive alternatives and transformative safety, like we're going to be doing tonight, a lot of the push in my job towards surveillance and kind of my own acceptance of a policing mentality was fear of very real possibilities on campus and elsewhere, and things that, you know, did happen, do happen, theft, rape and sexual assault, active shooters, ever since Virginia Tech have, you know, we never had one, thank God, but it happened to other places and was part of the logic. So tonight, I think our question is not how do we identify and catch and punish the bad guy after the bad thing happens, which is what cameras are for, or else tracking people in general. But how can we take all those resources and put them toward identifying and addressing the root causes of those things, and providing mental health, economic security, and so forth as a community, and change the script so that the bad things don't happen. So that's mine. I could say a million other things about that, but that's me, and thank you.
Thanks so much. And next, Carmela from the Asian Solidarity Collective.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carmela Prudencio. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm an organizer with Asian Solidarity Collective. I am currently a member of our action committee. So shout out to Mike, Maya, and Seska, who are also part of our ASC action committee that are with us tonight, who can help talk about some of the work that we're doing to help keep each other safe as we go out to different mobilizations on the ground. I'm here today to talk about certain experiences I've had as an activist who, like many of us, were compelled to go out to the different protests and rallies that peaked around the summertime. And, you know, I think a lot of us, it was the first time that I really engaged in protests of that level. So one of the first ones that I participated in was that downtown protest that was around, I think, like June or May, which was the first time that I'd ever experienced tear gas, rubber bullets, and really seeing the violence that that is perpetuated by police. And, you know, going out to these things and being somewhat naive to what the security issues and the risks are going on the grounds. I went out, just regular me, like a lot of us, and went out to provide mutual aid on the grounds. So that was like, you know, providing remedial first aid or water bottles or whatever we could do as part of my affinity group that I was with, to help keep each other safe and really provide the most care that we can. And so with all of that happening, I became more and more involved in organizing mutual aid efforts, as well as just working behind the scenes to look at what security looked like, being present on these grounds. And with all of that happening, there's a lot of invisible threats that I did not consider going into these actions. So digital security is something that I've learned a lot about in my experience this summer as an activist, and you know, something that really like propelled me into wanting to learn more about surveillance and digital security was myself being surveilled by federal agents. So just a few days after that protest in downtown, that day of that huge North Park protest, federal agents came to my door. And it was definitely something that I did not expect, especially with the idea of me just being on the grounds handing water bottles out to people, you know. But as our movement increases, the threat of us being able to succeed in the work that we're doing is more and more apparent to these systems, to these oppressive carceral systems that exist right now. And so with that happening to me, it really scared the shit out of me, to be honest. And I'm sure it would everybody else too. But it made me really aware of my presence on the ground and how me as an individual and as part of a whole collective, how my safety impacts the safety of my community. So, you know, after that, I was like in black bloc, hiding my face, all of these things, and then really looking into all this information about facial recognition technology, the smart street lights. I like found a map and was like, oh my God, there's one like right outside of my house. So the awareness heightened. And I think that really made me a better organizer and a better part of the whole. And that's really important to me in the work that I do as an organizer with Asian Solidarity Collective and just as a community member here in San Diego, to be able to see what impact we as individuals have on the rest of us without us even knowing. So part of being on the action committee for Asian Solidarity Collective is about a lot of different trainings. So a few months ago, we partook in like a digital security training, which we learned about risk assessment going out on the grounds, like, do we have contingency plans when we're going to actions together? Because even if me, Carmela, as an individual goes out there, I'm still a part of a larger community. And they have my back in making sure that I feel safe. And I want to make sure that I'm doing that justice for my community by taking precautions going out there. So yeah, with like a lot of that risk assessment stuff, there's things that I've just been trying to consider with like, the overlapping identities that make me up. So like whether that's being, a first generation American, a queer person, a woman of color, a cis woman, like all of these overlapping identities affect the potential of risk for me being on the grounds, whether that's with police or just agitators that are going out there. And that's something that we all need to consider as activists and as organizers, is assessing the risk of the people that we're there to support and to be accomplices for. So yeah, I don't want to go too much crazy into all of this stuff because I'm really looking forward to being able to brainstorm with you all what those alternatives to the security looks like, because I've learned a lot in the experiences I've had in this past year. And I know that the biggest thing that's helped me feel safe is being a part of a community, and a community that's really looking for genuine care and building those relationships. Like that week that like the FBI stopped by my house, like one of the people from Asian Solidarity Collective sent me like a dozen spam musubi to my house because I was freaked out and was like, I don't want to leave my house. I'm peering out my window. And that's the community care that I really think is how we should be brainstorming what those alternatives look like, because the more that we're able to identify what's happening within our community to our community members, the more we're able to provide support for what they're looking for too. But yeah, I don't want to ramble too much about all of that. Feel free to ask questions in the chat or whatever, but that's all I got.
Thanks so much. And yeah, thank you for sharing those experiences. So as I said, I'm a PhD student, and I study technology abuse and cybersecurity in the context of intimate partner violence. So that includes things like stalking, harassment, image-based abuse, or what's sometimes called revenge porn, and generally coercive and controlling behavior online. And I'm also, as a part of that, researching the kind of networks of support that form to help survivors defend themselves and heal after abuse. And I think this can be a lens for thinking about safety without surveillance in a couple of different ways. So I think firstly, it puts a lot of focus on the ways in which many of these technologies originated for the purposes of military control. So in the way that they're built, they lend themselves easily to enabling coercive and controlling behaviors. So like keeping track of somebody's location all the time, or, sorry, let me. Yeah. So like keeping track of somebody's location all the time, demanding they check in constantly, and a lot of other kind of essentially surveillance behaviors are quite, I think, in some ways inherent to the logic of digital technologies. And so that also means I think it will take a conscious effort to build other ideas of safety into technology, or to build them kind of beyond these technologies. Because these are kind of the assumptions, like these hierarchical assumptions of someone at the top monitoring carefully the behavior of people below, is kind of what the purpose they initially were designed to serve. Another thing I think this casts a lot of light on is that the police, who are in theory meant to keep survivors safe and meant to be the people that you turn to for safety if something like this happens to you, in practice can often be very dismissive. So the phrase like "it's just a domestic" is kind of commonly repeated in police departments to dismiss domestic violence as a form of crime. And specifically with digital to abuses, they often come back with "there's nothing we can do," because the perpetrators will use anonymizing technology. And that kind of makes sense, because the whole modus operandi of the police is to catch perpetrators and to punish them. And so that's their focus as an organization, and they're in some ways not well equipped to actually be supporting safety for survivors, especially with these kind of newer forms of harm and abuse. But that's kind of on the one end, is like just not addressing the problem. But some of the things that police can do can perpetuate harm further and create re-traumatization. So for example, demanding that survivors give up all of the contents of their phone in order for the police to take their case seriously, which kind of recreates that coercive dynamic of having someone monitoring your phone. Or themselves perpetrating abuse, as in the, unfortunately, at this point, quite a few cases where police will use databases put together on just to surveil people, to research former partners or like potential romantic interests, which I think really highlights how when these kind of databases are put together, how important it is to have triple and quadruple checks to put in to prevent abuse or monitor abuse. Not just from like faraway hackers, but also from the people who themselves are putting that database together, who in theory are kind of imagined as creating security in that situation. And lastly, I think it also points us, or points me at least, towards thinking that the people who actually provide support for survivors or safety for survivors, who in practice often aren't the police, but are like counselors at domestic violence shelters or advocates, I think these kinds of people are good examples of how the values of safety without surveillance might be put in practice, because they spend a lot of time thinking about how to provide services in a way that's empowering and doesn't kind of use defending vulnerable people as an excuse to recreate coercive and controlling behaviors. So they think a lot about creating safe spaces, both in terms of physical spaces like shelters, but also safe spaces online that survivors can feel comfortable sharing in. They think about sort of the darker sides of care, so how care can be used to justify coercion and how to avoid it, or keep yourselves accountable to that. And I think their work kind of shows that you don't need to collect enormous amounts of everyone's data in order to mitigate against abuse. So often when I say I'm studying like cybersecurity and smart homes and domestic violence, people will ask whether I'm like rigging up smart homes to detect abuse through like creating a machine learning model that will spot coercive behaviors, which, because I think so much of our approach to abuse has that kind of penal element of catching people who are doing something wrong or catching abusers. And I think that's so ridiculous, because so often when survivors who know that abuse has happened to them report abuse to Facebook or to the police, their complaints aren't taken seriously. So we don't need to collect enormous amounts of data and create a machine learning model to detect abuse, when we could just start with abuse where it is identified and then support survivors. But all of these kind of approaches, so building kind of medical systems, mental health systems that have trauma-informed care, require a lot of resources. And even though we are kind of forever, as a society, seem to be forever willing to invest more and more money into new surveillance systems, we don't invest money into these kind of systems that support care. And we somehow think of them as like too resource intensive. So yeah, I want to I guess I want a society that invests in these systems of care rather than systems of surveillance, and to understand the distinctions between the two. And so that's kind of what I'd like to discuss with you all today. But with that, I think the next part of the event will be breakout room discussions, where let me So Christy is now going to separate us out into breakout rooms. So I think one interesting thing that came across in all three of our talks is how much kind of these subjects of safety and surveillance, inevitably they touch very much on your own kind of personal lived experiences. I think we were all speaking from kind of, yeah, very much in ways that intersect with our own life and experiences. So I think everyone has a lot of different answers to bring to these questions. So we'll start kind of, oh, this is not what I wanted. So we'll start with just brief introductions, name, pronouns, and then an icebreaker of what does the word safety mean to you? And pretty much, yeah, Christy, whenever you're ready, feel free to take us in. And I guess while we're waiting, I guess think about what your own answers to this question are. Okay, I want to stop sharing my screen.
Kensington. And I guess, I don't know,